Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talky Taffy. I'm Emily.
I'm Doug. Hello.
Hi, and here we take little bites of some sweet nuggets of information and stretch it out. Um, so let's get right into it. And I have a question for both Doug and Chat today. Do you know your astrological sign?
Yeah, I'm like a Capricorn. That,
Capricorn,
that's
excellent.
all I know.
What about your Chinese zodiac sign?
Is that dependent on what year I'm born?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a doggo.
You're a doggo?
Yep.
Doggo the doggo. Very
Woof.
nice. What about your Hogwarts house?
Ravenclaw. Easy. You know that one.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
What kind of are
Um,
you? Air, water, earth, fire?
oh yeah, yeah.
We'll keep going.
David says I give off firebender vibes, which I kind of agree with.
You do eat Talky, so that
Um,
makes sense.
yep. I'm also a Cancer, so I'm a Cancer. I am a Piggy, and I am a Slytherin. So there's that. Um, so do you think that when you read up on these signs or these, like your Hogwarts house or whatever, do you think that's an accurate representation of you?
I actually think the Pottermore Hogwarts house quiz did a pretty good job of sorting. I mean, I feel like it's a little bit biased of a quiz because you kind of know what you want to answer to get put into the house that you identify with. As far as the other astrological things, no, I think for the most part, horoscopes are broad sweeping generalizations that can
So
apply to anyone.
interesting that you should say that because, okay, so y'all, I have to apologize a little bit. I felt a little bit bad when we were promoting this week's podcast because although it's true that we will be talking about horoscopes today, it won't necessarily be in the traditional sense of reading each other's natal charts and horoscopes and stuff like that. Rather, I'm actually a little bit more interested in talking about the origins of astrology, its recent growth in popularity, especially these days, and the psychology behind what makes astrology so widespread. So, what's a horoscope? I'm sure a lot of people know what a horoscope is, but just so we get the definition out there, a horoscope, according to our good old friend Wikipedia, is an astrological chart or diagram representing the positions of the sun, moon, planets, astrological aspects, and sensitive angles at the time of an event, such as the moment of a person's birth. It's a form of divination, and horoscopes refer to an astrologist's interpretation of someone's astrological chart. So, there are many different kinds of astrology across many different cultures, not just the Western one that we're familiar with. There's like calendar event-based a short form of astrology that you see in like Chinese culture. You see stars and moon movement in Hindu astrology, for instance. So the one that we are most familiar with, or the one that comes to mind, at least when I mention astrology, is natal astrology, which is a system of astrology based on the concept that each individual's personality or path in life can be determined by constructing a natal chart for the exact date, time, and locations of that individual's birth. And this can be found in many different types of traditions, including like Indian, Chinese, and Western. So even if you aren't super into astrology, like I actually had never really gone deep into the study of astrology up until really this week. I really dove deep into learning more about what it's all about. And even so, I'm sure people have heard things like fire sign, water sign, or even things like, oh, Mercury's in retrograde, so therefore dot 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 dot.
That's my favorite
So
one, by the
it's
way.
yeah.
Apparent
It's
retrograde, for
definitely
the record.
it's definitely found its way into popular culture. So let's take a step back though and look at the history of astrology. So, one of the earliest and most significant sciences to have ever emerged from humanity is that relating to the observation of the heavens with astronomy and star mapping. So it's only natural that humans began to relate their findings in the sky to what was happening on Earth. So even as early, at least during the time of the Babylonians, we see the study of astrology and astronomy, but this really became more widespread during the Hellenistic period, after the death of Alexander the Great around 323 BC. So Ptolemy, a Greek astronomer circa 100 AD, was a astronomer who pursued the study of predicting the movement of planets and stars. And during this time, the concept of microcosm and macrocosm was really, really popular. And what that is the idea that there was a structural similarity between humans and the cosmos as a whole. And that was a popular concept in Western astrology during his time. So this influenced the belief that astrological findings had significance in both medicine and in the general health of the human body. However, even during Ptolemy's time, we see a divergence between the study of astronomy and astrology, and this only becomes greater as time passes. We see a clear rejection of astrology, at least in Western scientific traditions, from astronomy, beginning in like 1670s with like, as you see in like publications like the La Connaissance de Temps, which is a French astronomical science journal. So even there, we start to see a pretty strong rejection, separating astrology from different scientific endeavors. So astrology has been pretty problematic with the scientific and psychological communities for quite some time now. And it's really impossible to discuss the history of astrology without bringing up the topic of pseudoscience. So, what is a pseudoscience? So pseudoscience, again, thanks to our good old friend Wikipedia, consists of statements, beliefs, or practices that claim to be both scientific and factual, but are incompatible with the scientific method. It is often characterized by contradictory, exaggerated, or unfalsifiable claims, which we'll get to, reliance on confirmation bias rather than rigorous attempts at refutation, lack of openness to evaluation by other experts, absence of systematic practices when developing hypotheses, and continued adherence long after pseudoscientific hypotheses have been experimentally discredited. So pseudoscience is often brought up in many different circles, including like medical circles with homeopathic and some alternative medicine remedies. We see pseudoscience come up in climate change denial, alchemy, and of course, astronomy is brought up a lot with pseudoscience. And despite astrology's popularity today, it is important to understand that astrology is indeed classified as a pseudoscience, and why, even though it is so popular and widespread in our modern culture. There are many different scientific philosophies that have discussed the scientific credibility or lack thereof of astrology. So some ideas are that, like I mentioned, falsifiability. So Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, he claimed that astrology is a pseudoscience because astrology is pseudo-empirical, somewhat measurable, but largely subjective, and appeals to observation experimentation, but nevertheless does not come up to scientific standards.
And I think I think that's an important point to make too. Is that a lot of times these pseudosciences are born in something that is scientific and factual, like the position of the planets in our solar system, and you can even run statistics with them, and you'll see trends emerge. But if you do a large enough study and approach it with the scientific method, I think you'll largely see that there is no correlation there. Although you can still end up in situations where 1 out of 20 studies will point to a correlation there if you're using a 95% confidence interval. That's standard.
It's funny that you should bring that up, because we'll definitely get to
there,
some of the studies that have happened in terms of trying to see how reliable astrology is in terms of predicting personality traits or aptitude in different fields. So we'll get there. Let's see. So another philosophy that adheres to the idea that astrology is a pseudoscience is the idea, as presented by Thomas Kuhn, that astrology isn't a pseudoscience necessarily because it's because of its falsifiability, but it's more, quote, akin to medieval medicine, where they followed a sequence of practices and guidelines for a seemingly necessary field with known shortcomings, but they did no research because the fields were not quite amenable to research. Where astronomers could correct for failure, astrologists could not. And usually, if there was some sort of falseness that was found with findings, they could usually be explained away through, oh, well, it's subjective and things like that. Paul Thagard believes that progress, practice, and consistency are essential to the demarcation between science and pseudoscience, where the practices focus on comparing their approach to others, have a consistent approach, and try to falsify their theory through experimentation, meaning rather than adjusting the theory to avoid falsification, an alternative theory should replace it instead. So I found this really interesting experiment that was done by scientists and astrologists to some degree. Goglin, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but he did an experiment where he asked an astrologer to cast a horoscope for a birth date that he claimed to be his own. So the reading was extremely flattering, and it said, quote, "He is a Virgo, instinctive warmth is allied with intellect and wit. He is endowed with a moral sense which is comforting, that of a worthy, right-thinking citizen whose life finds expression in a total devotion to others." That was really interesting because, as I said, consistency and reliability is a little bit difficult when it comes to astrology. And that birthday ended up being that of Marcel Petiot, a French doctor who had robbed and killed 27 people as they sought shelter from the Nazis. So that led to some conflicting information over here.
Seems sus.
So leading into some other scientific experiments that were done and studies to prove or disprove the practice of astrology as a scientific endeavor, the general consensus is that astrological predictions are no more accurate than mere chance guesses. No scientific support has come out that astrology or horoscopes are accurate indicators of personality, aptitude, and there are 3 very famous experiments that I kind of wanted to touch up on to kind of support this idea. So we've got Sean Carlson. He had 28 astrologers analyze 100 natal charts and match them to psychological profiles in a double-blind study. The astrologers were provided by the National Council for Geocosmic Research, which was an astrological association, and they all agreed that that this experiment was done on fair terms. They selected their supposedly best astrologers and most confident astrologers. And what ended up happening is that in the published paper that came out in 1985, it confirmed that astrological predictions were not much better than chance. Another study that was done by Jeffrey Dean, who was a scientist and former astrologer, and Ivan Kelly, a psychologist, found in one scientific study that when trying to categorize people by birth date, their 45 astrologers performed worse than their 45 control group who didn't even use birth charts at all in terms of categorizing personality traits based off of birth date. And that also reminds me, I saw a YouTube video not too long ago. It's like Cut 100 is the channel, I think, and they had an astrologer like ask people different questions about themselves and try to categorize them and see what sign they were, and he less than 50% of the time he was correct. So that was kind of interesting to watch and a little bit cringy as well.
I bet. I love that with like psychics. If if you give them just a little bit of false information, they'll run with it. It's very entertaining to watch that.
So now the last study that I kind of want to touch up on was the Mars effect, which was very interesting to me, which was another high-profile study done by Michael Gauguin, same guy from before, in 1955, where he found that there was a possible statistical correlation between athletic aptitude and the position of Mars on the horizon at the time of the person's birth, which is interesting because Mars is the Roman god of war. So there's that correlation between Roman mythology and athletic aptitude, where it was supposedly statistically significant the number of sports champions that were born during this time period. He had originally started his study with general success and aptitude, but found that athleticism was more measurable, so that's what he ended up sticking to. His findings were initially accepted by Hans Eysenck, a psychologist who produced the Eysenck personality test, if anyone is familiar with that, as well as several other scientists, but the findings were eventually found to be not replicable. His studies likely suffered from selection bias, as well as self-reporting bias from his subjects, and as well as an incorporation of too many variables that resulted in false positives in terms of statistical significance. So that was really interesting because when I was initially doing my research for this, it was so hard to find unbiased references for the Mars effect, because when you look up the Mars effect, the first couple of things that come up are astrological websites that use his study as a positive supporter of the accuracy of astrology. But when you go deeper into it, you find that when people tried to replicate his study, it was either influenced by Gauguin himself, and he had a hand in selecting his groups, or they just are not replicable.
So they conveniently left out that scientific context of those studies.
Yeah. So now for the most significant and important part, astrology and popular culture.
I want to talk about statistical significance a little bit. If you ever read that something is statistically significant in a single study, look for second and third replications of that study before you believe it to be true. Even one study is fairly convincing, but it's not a guarantee. So look for replication. And that's something I want to talk about in a future episode, but I digress.
Yeah, definitely. And if anything, this whole sort of study that I did on astrology and the history of astrology just kind of reminded me to be wary of my own scientific literacy or lack thereof. So that was really interesting.
One more thing I wanted to mention too that kind of relates to some of the things that you're talking about, where you can find a correlation in something. Remember, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers did such a tremendous job talking about where correlations can exist, where causations might not initially seem or be what they seem to be. Like, for instance, if you were born in the San Francisco Valley in the mid-1950s, you were so much more likely to be involved in technology than anyone else. And in some cases, people of the same, brilliance level and ability and network ability level, like their interpersonal skills and everything, born anywhere else except the San Francisco Valley would have had no chance in becoming Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, etc. So a big part of that is just opportunity, being in the right place at the right time, because there's a little bit more silicon in the soil in the Bay Area. So read Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell, tremendous book.
I might have to take a look at that because that sounds really, really interesting. All right, so astrology in popular culture. So what everybody came here for. In popular culture today, you know, it's amazing how trendy astrology has become, especially in the last year or two. I'm seeing not only horoscopes in like newspapers, which has existed for a long time, but like astrology apps and videos with titles like The Astrological Signs as Cats, The Astrological Signs as The Office characters, or things like that. And then I was even on Spotify the other day, and it was like, here are some playlists based off of the different astrological signs, and I was just like, it's everywhere, especially once I started looking for it.
You were Googling it, the algorithm gotcha.
Maybe that's it too, yeah. And it's interesting how for a lot of people, particularly amongst young millennial and Gen Xers, it's become not only a meme, but a lot more than that. And modern astrology, as we know it though, arose probably in the 1960s and the 1970s with the New Age movement, which was a movement that spread through the occult and metaphysical religious communities in the 1970s and 80s. And it looked forward to a new age of love and light and offered a foretaste of the coming era through personal transformation and healing. And it is in this movement that we start to see the beginnings of like the wellness movement or the self-care movement. And that has definitely evolved a lot since then. Despite the assertion that astrology is a pseudoscience amongst the scientific community, a study in 2014 by the National Science Foundation found that American skepticism of astrology was actually decreasing. The same study found that 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds believed that astrology was actually a scientific tradition. Another study by the American Psychological Association found in 2014 that millennials, and here we have another case of correlation, causation, maybe, who knows, that millennials were the most stressed generation and were the most likely to say that their stress has spiked since 2010, and that them and the Gen Xers are significantly more stressed than older generations. So that leads into several theories as to why astrology has become so popular today. Like I mentioned, there's the self-care movement and the wellness industry boom, and we begin to see a lot of references to the internal and external locus of control. So what that is basically whether or not a person perceives how much control they have over different aspects of their life. So interestingly, women were more likely to say that to register as a external locus of control than men, which is to say that they believe more in things like destiny or circumstance, religion, astrology, the power of the universe, things like that, having more influence over the course of their lives than personal choice. So there's also the belief that because there's that belief in external locus of control, and we're seeing that a lot in stressed out generations, that astrology has become more popular amongst people like that. We also see that in Google search histories, at least in the UK, beginning in 2010, searches for wellness and horoscopes have doubled since then. Another idea is that we live in an age of uncertainty with so much happening with like the climate and the government and just general social justice, things like that. People are looking for ways to eliminate ambiguity in their lives. And so as humans, we're hardwired to dislike and avoid uncertainty, and it produces this acute stress response. And so people could be turning to astrology as a way to cope and understand what ways they can kind of navigate those uncertainties. Interestingly enough, there was a study done in 1982 by psychologist Graham Tyson, where he found that people with anxieties regarding their social roles or their relationships were more likely to turn to astrology than not. So the Barnum-Forer effect is basically the phenomenon that occurs when individuals believe that personality descriptions apply specifically to them more so than to others, despite the fact that the description is actually filled with information that applies to everyone. So the Barnum-Forer effect is named after two people. So Barnum is P.T. Barnum, if you recognize that name from The Greatest Showman. He was the head guy, and he was attributed to saying possibly falsely, "There's a sucker born every minute." So it's in reference to the gullibility of humans if you feed them just the right amount of information.
Or animal crackers.
Or animal crackers, that too.
Gotcha.
So Forer, on the other hand, is a psychologist, Bertram Forer. In 1948, he performed a very, very famous experiment where he gave a psychology test to 39 of his psych students. They were told that if they filled out this little test, that he would provide them with a vignette or sketch based on their results that was personalized to them. A week later, he gave them their results and had them read through it and had them rate on a scale of 0 being very bad to 5 very accurate, how accurate they think this personality result was to them. And the average test score that was given was 4.3. So pretty darn accurate. However, after he had gotten all of their information, he said that he actually received the results from an astrological reading on a newsstand, and everyone had received the exact same results. So this experiment has been replicated, redone with very, very similar results, although the scores can rank even higher if there are additional things like the subject believes that the analysis applies only to him or her and thus applies his or her own meanings to the statement, or the subject believes in the authority of the evaluator, and the analysis lists mainly positive traits, and people are more willing to attribute positive things to themselves rather than to negative things. So this results had things like, you have a great need for other people to like and admire you. While you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them.
It's those very general statements that
at times you have serious doubts as to whether you have made the right decision or done the right thing. So like,
never had that.
Yeah, very, very generalized statements. But when asked if these things applied to that person, usually comes back with very, very high positive results. So, what does all of this mean for astrology? There are a few things, and in terms of what to be wary of, be wary of pseudoscientific practices. That's number one thing that I found through all of this. That is not to say all pseudoscientific things are nefarious in nature, but just because something is presented as being scientific doesn't mean that it is.
Probably has a different objective than being science.
Yes. And for instance, and these are the more nefarious examples, but pseudoscience has led to things like anti-vaccine sentiment or climate change denial, or even things as extreme as genocide, where pseudoscientific practices and results were used to justify things like that. So just beware of your own scientific literacy or lack thereof, and really make sure that you look into doing the correct kind of research when you are looking into things like that. Be careful of allowing arbitrary means of categorizing people and personalities to dictate how you live your life or how you perceive other people. So like when I Googled astrology, some of the related Google searches that came up were things like what sign is the worst sign? What sign is the meanest sign? Who should a Scorpio date? Things like that. And those are things that I think people should be really wary of as far as these sort of generalizations that are coming from something that is also very, very generalized to make it seem like it's true, but it's actually not. But these dangers can apply to any sort of personality categorizations. And the important thing is that if you choose to adhere to astrological thinking, try to perceive it as a means of self-reflection rather than dictation. So that leads into what can we learn from astrology and what are the positive aspects that we can find in astrology. So like I mentioned in the dreams episode, we can use astrology and horoscopes as opportunities to reevaluate and consciously examine our own psyches. They're great bonding opportunities and conversation starters. So like I mentioned, like, what Hogwarts sorting house are you? Like, clearly that doesn't really mean much, but it's a great fun way to like get to know somebody and what they think of not only pop culture, but what they perceive as far as their own personality. They can also be a great starting point for examining your own personality and your own faults, and can start the journey of self-improvement. I just want to end this whole thing on this great quote that I found by Bertram Moll, a social cognitive scientist at Brown University. And they said, quote, "Let me state first that I consider astrology a cultural or psychological phenomenon, not a scientific one. But full-fledged astrology that goes beyond newspaper-style sun sign horoscopes provides a powerful vocabulary to capture not only personality and temperament, but also life's challenges and opportunities. To the extent that one simply learns this vocabulary, it may be appealing as a rich way of representing, not explaining or predicting, human experiences and life events, and identifying some possible paths of coping." And I thought that was a really, really intelligent way of not necessarily undermining the significance that astrology has in the popular culture right now, but also kind of finding a way to take astrology and astrological thinking and putting it towards not necessarily scientific means, but something more subjective, such as self-improvement. So that is today's talk on horoscopes and astrology. I hope I didn't offend any people with what I said today, because I know a lot of people who love astrology, but I think it's also important to be aware of where astrology stands in the scientific community as well. But it's also not something that we should be undermining in terms of its significance in popular culture.
Yeah, to put it in context a little bit, I mean, to your point, a lot of this science that's been studied has been, disproven in the scientific community, or at least not confirmed. But ultimately, there is a purpose to astrology still, because it gives some people meaning. Like you say, it's a great conversation starter. It really is. It can give people an explanation for why things are happening when there really is no explanation. A lot of stuff in life is just random, but having something to point to, like, hey, Mercury's in retrograde, apparent retrograde, that kind of thing, I think helps rationalize things that are irrational. I would say the same about religion. I don't think it comes as a surprise that I'm a bit atheist, but I don't mind if people incorporate this into their lives. It doesn't affect me one way or the other. If it helps rationalize something for a person and put them at ease, I'm all for that. You do that for yourself. It's probably not something I'm going to do as a person who dictates my life with science, but I literally don't care if people want to relate on these kind of things. So.
And I mean, this is also coming from someone who I personally love things like personality tests and, you know, the Hogwarts sorting house thing. That's like, that's my jam. I love stuff like that. And like categorizing things is just extremely satisfying for me. And I'm sure it is for a lot of people. And astrology is not any different from that. And in fact, I was actually really interested in learning more about astrology, not just because it's like popular in popular culture right now, but like just the idea of like having fun categorizing things and events is just like really satisfying to me. So that's not to say that I think it's that I would never do something like that. No, that's not even remotely true. I think astrology is really fun, and like I enjoy like, you know, those YouTube videos that are like, oh, here are the astrological signs as dog pictures. Like that that is my jam. I love those things.
That
and I
sounds
like to
a
see
BuzzFeed
like
thing, right?
yeah, like okay, where's the Cancer one? And I want to see what dog I am, and like, you know, it's always fun to do things like that. So
yeah, and I mean
yeah.
it is an entertainment industry. There's millions, probably billions of dollars in that. So, you know, go make your money. Like I said, I'm fine. I don't care if you want to do that. It's just not something that I plan to participate in.
Yeah.
Fun.
I mean,
I will say too, like with the Hogwarts houses that you're talking about, I think Pottermore is kind of the standard for that. Obviously, there's some in the actual in the printed work itself that talks about how it's categorized, but the Pottermore, like that's a quiz that you take, and then it categorizes your personality based on the quiz and matches it up with one of those houses. I mean, there definitely is like self-reporting bias there. You're gonna maybe fib a little bit about what your personality is like oh yeah, I'm definitely brave, when really you're not when you're put in that situation. But I think it is more scientific than astrology in my opinion, because astrology to me is just something that's random chance.
Yeah. Oh, like speaking of which, I always use my dad as an example because by his birthday, he should be a Leo. But if you know my father, he is anything but a Leo in terms of like the stereotypical personality traits that you see in those kinds of people. So, and it was funny because my mom has a friend who is an astrologer, and she was shocked when my dad told her his birthday, because she was like, oh, that doesn't seem right. Are you sure that's your birthday? Like, wow. So that was really really funny and interesting. But the Hogwarts thing is so fun because there must be something about wanting to belong as well. Something about categorizing yourself kind of generates that feeling of belonging and fitting in somewhere. So I really like doing those, and then they added even more with like the wand test and the Patronus thing, where you can find out what your Patronus was. That was super fun too.
Yeah, I mean, labeling, categorization, and belonging are instinctual, primal human needs. So I think that's why these kinds of things gather the traction that they do.
For sure.
Anyway, speaking about pseudoscience and how it can be dangerous to our planet, have you heard of Carbon 180? It's a pretty amazing charity that's focused on the very real science of climate change and removing carbon from our atmosphere to slow the rate of global warming on our beloved Earth. There's two things you need to do to remove carbon from the atmosphere. One, you need to stop putting it in there, and two, you need to take it out. Carbon 180 is focused on that second thing, but removing carbon from the air. It's really just kind of on a voluntary donation basis right now. There's no real good way to make money on that. But Carbon 180 is a place where you can put your money toward the betterment of the overall society. It's a pretty selfless thing to do. So if you're able to contribute, we would really appreciate it. I'll put it. No, Emily, you beat me to it. There's a link in chat if you want to go check out our charity drive for that. On our next episode, we will be talking about our next charity. And do we want to tease that a little bit?
Sure, up to you.
Cool. I'll let you take this one, if that's okay.
Okay.
If you, sorry,
so
just put you on the spot.
For our next charity, we would like to contribute to, I want to get the correct name because I don't know it off the top
National
of my
Asian
head.
American and Pacific Women's Forum.
With everything that's been going on, especially in the current events, I felt that this was something that was particularly relevant, especially to me and the social climate that we have in our country, especially right now. And so next week we'd like to talk about the Asian American experience. Is that correct?
Next fortnight. Yeah.
Yes, next episode, and we'll kind of have a bit of a discussion on that, and we would really appreciate it if you guys could tune in for that. I'll be talking a little bit about my own experience as an Asian American and some of the conflicting emotions that have really come about with the pandemic and everything that's been going on, and how my feelings have really kind of changed as all of this stuff has been happening. So yeah, that would be something that we would really like to share with other people and to kind of spread awareness, as I'm sure a lot of people are doing right now. But yeah, that's something we can look forward to for next time.
Yeah, following the events of 8 days ago, it prompted us to change our plans for what our charity drive will be for the next quarter. So I have no regrets about that. I would support this charity 1,000 times if it meant making a difference. So I'm really hoping to see some change in the world. I mean, it's worth noting that a lot of this stuff with Asian Americans is pretty fresh. If you talk about some of the legal changes we've seen, I mean, 1965 was a pretty significant year for regulatory change as it pertains to Chinese immigration. And then even just 2 months ago, our new president, Joe Biden, put out a memorandum about discrimination and hate toward Asian Americans. And then, of course, 8 days ago, the tragic shooting at the spa in Atlanta. And I think this is where we want to see change, because clearly things are not changing quickly enough and it's costing lives.
Yep. So on that
note,
right note.
You can join our Discord. Honestly, we'd love to have these conversations. There's not enough time in the day to talk about everything. You can also get Go Live notifications on Twitter, and these VODs will always be live on YouTube after the fact, even if we are no longer, if the VOD drops off of Twitch. If you're watching or listening to us remotely, you can catch us on Twitch Live. We stream every other Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Central, asterisk. But yeah, yeah. I mean, honestly, the things we've seen, especially in the last week or two, are pretty tragic. And I know that it seems like the world's kind of a crappy place at times, but you can make a difference. So we're here to spread the love and information. That's really a big thing for me, is just like, let's stop the misinformation. But yeah, we can provide resources if you need help with any mental health conditions, anything like that. Let's go out and love each other.
All right. Thank you so much for coming, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.